Good afternoon. I'm John Matea, President of the Goldwater Foundation. On behalf of the Goldwater Board and the Foundation, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. 2019 is a milestone year for the Foundation. It will be the 30th consecutive year the Foundation has awarded scholarships honoring the life's work of Senator Barry Goldwater to undergraduates who intend to pursue research careers in the natural sciences, mathematics, and engineering. We have awarded $65 million to over 8,100 scholars. Thousands of additional students have received honorable mentions. I am certain that Senator Goldwater would be extremely proud of what's been achieved. As we celebrate this important milestone, it would serve us well to think about the future. While the scholarship support is certainly important, the board sees considerable value in supporting additional activities that will enable Goldwater scholars to help and to work collaboratively with other scholars. Today's webinar, designed to connect Goldwater awardees from our 2017 and 2018 classes with an outstanding group of Goldwater scholars who are currently in graduate school. It is an example of what we hope to do. It is a first step in building a community of Goldwater scholars. The graduate students are here today to share what they have learned from going through the graduate school and graduate school application processes and to answer your questions. They are an amazing group of students. Our 12 graduate students have collectively won 14 nationally competitive fellowships. That's an amazing record. As I mentioned, this webinar is part of a larger community building effort. We know that only a small number of your graduate school questions are going to be answered today. To allow you to continue this discussion, several Goldwater scholars and I created a workspace called the Goldwater Scholar Community on a Slack platform. All 2017 and 18 Goldwater awardees will, in the next day or so, be sent an invitation to join this workspace. I've actually already sent you an email alerting you to this fact about 2 hours ago. Please join the Slack workspace. While we are focusing on graduate school application processes right now, you can use the Slack workspace to start or join any discussion you like. Goldwater scholars who are chemists may want to start a conversation among all the chemists. Others may want to start a women in science discussion. What is created on this Slack workspace is up to you. It's now time to start the webinar. I would like our Scholarship America support team to introduce themselves and tell you how to use the webinar's chat features to submit your questions. Amanda?
Hello, this is the Scholarship America team. I'm Amanda, Senior Manager, and I'm joined by Linda Zolsdorf, who is the Program Manager that handles the day-to-day management of the Barry Goldwater Scholarship Program. We also have Moises Lima Guerrero, who is part of the Implementation Services team. Thank you for joining the webinar today. As John mentioned, we'll be here monitoring the chat function and selecting questions for the panelists to answer. Please submit your questions using the questions box on your screen. Later in the webinar, Linda will be asking our panelists a few of your questions. We're also here for support. If you have any questions regarding the GoToWebinar, please contact us via the chat function and we will try our best to assist you. Lastly, there is a brief survey at the end of the webinar. We would love your feedback, and so please complete that survey. Enjoy.
Next, each of our panelists will briefly introduce him or herself. After going through the 6 introductions, each panelist will talk about their graduate school and fellowship application experiences. Finally, the panelists will respond to your questions, which Linda will be asking the panelists to respond to. As we've already said, the GoToWebinar platform can only display 6 individuals at one time. Since we have 6 panelists, I'm going to disappear and our 6th panelist will take my place. We will proceed in alphabetical order, so Alex is up first. Enjoy the webinar. I will return near the end of the webinar.
Hello, so I am Alex Carney. I first got the Goldwater Scholarship in 2011 when I was an undergrad at University of Michigan. I studied math there, And then after that, I won a Marshall Scholarship and went over to England for 2 years. I did a master's in math at Cambridge and then a master's in science and technology studies at University College London. And then after that, I started a PhD in math at Berkeley, which is where I currently am. And I am maybe in somewhat the same boat as many of you right now, in that I'm on the kind of applications process and all of that right now as well, hopefully finishing the PhD this year and looking at what comes next after that.
Hi everyone, my name is Melissa J. I'm a PhD student in biostatistics at the University of Iowa. I was awarded the Goldwater Scholarship in 2015 when I was studying math at Colorado College. And that's it. Thanks.
Hi, this is Rachel Rosem. I got a Goldwater Scholarship while doing my undergraduate at Utah State in physics. And then I am now working on a PhD in ecology at Pennsylvania State University, where I went on to work with the NSF Fellowship.
Okay, hi, I'm Julianne. I'm a PhD student at Yale studying environmental engineering. I got my BS at UC Riverside, and after that I went to Germany on a Fulbright scholarship and was awarded NSF Fellowship for my graduate work.
I'm Jordan. I got a Goldwater Scholarship in 2013 while I was studying math and physics at Utah State University. I have gone through 3 first years of grad school. So I did a master's in mathematics at Utah State University. And then I started the PhD program at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and then transferred over to the physics program at Pennsylvania State University, so that my wife Rachel, who you heard from just a few seconds ago, I guess, and I could go to school together. So I have gone through the application process many times. I'm an expert now. And yeah, I guess that's all I have to say right now.
Hi, I'm Justin Strickland. I received the Goldwater in 2013 while I was studying biology and psychology at Davidson College. I'm currently a PhD student in experimental psychology at the University of Kentucky, finishing up my 5th year, so I'm in the same boat as Alex of looking for the next application process. And I think that's about it.
So if each of you want to go back through and just talk a little bit about your experience, just really briefly, and then we'll start in with the questions.
All right, so I guess that brings me back up with the longer version now. So let's see. So maybe start talking a little bit about some of the like national scholarships and those sort of things from my experience. So I ended up doing a Marshall Scholarship, but additionally applied for, let's see, Rhodes and Gates and Churchill as well, which are probably relevant to many of you. And did an interview for Rhodes, and then since I got the Marshall, withdrew from Churchill and Gates, but sort of went through the beginning part of those processes as well. So maybe one of the first things I'll say is, despite having kind of applied for everything at that point, I really didn't know what I was doing. We had a decent scholarship office at Michigan, who I knew some of the people there, and they had kind of reached out to me at one point the year before and said, hey, you might be a good candidate for some of these. Have you thought about applying? And I said, well, no, I don't even really know what those are. I've maybe heard of 1 or 2 of them, but that's about it. And then went from that to just kind of learning more from them, talking to other people, and decided it was an interesting opportunity worth looking into, and kind of went from there. So maybe one of the things I'd say is that, so that process tends to be maybe a little bit before the graduate school applications process. So those applications, there are kind of multiple stages to many of them, but usually there's something due maybe like September or October versus like November, December for graduate schools. So the great thing there is there's kind of nothing to lose and a whole lot to gain in it as a practice round for grad school applications, in that so since I ended up getting the Marshall, I didn't end up completing applications to grad school that year, but did sort of do much of the beginning work on things. And the great thing was, by that point, when I was looking at writing, say, a personal statement for grad school applications, I already had a personal statement that had been reviewed by maybe 4 or 5 people, had gone through several rounds of edits, and had a lot of feedback on it and a lot of sort of tweaking to get it where I wanted. And so it is really a nice opportunity to kind of, even setting aside for the moment the idea of actually getting one of these, to just take sort of have a chance to evaluate where you're at, what your interests are, what you want to do post undergrad, and then to usually at your school you'll have some good resources there to help you through the application process. You'll be talking to letter writers and advisors early on to kind of get plenty of help for that. So having gone through that, then the grad school applications were kind of a lot easier, I thought. And then of course the upside is you may very well get lucky and actually get one of these. I wouldn't go into it sort of ever assuming you would, or sort of holding out that that's the main goal, because I think the way it works is there are a lot of qualified, and I think for the Goldwater as well, a lot of qualified people apply, and you certainly have to be good to get one, but it doesn't mean by any means that the rest of the people who didn't were not just as qualified, and things just sort of work out as they do each year. So don't be disappointed if you don't, but it can't hurt to give it a shot. And I did really enjoy my experience in England, the 2 years I had there. So maybe the second thing I'll say, I hope I'm not going on too long, is that, so with that, both my time in England and then in the PhD program here at Berkeley the past 4 years, is that there's really a lot to be gotten out of grad school outside of just the sort of the specifics of your degree, the whatever particular kind of research you're doing. So certainly my time in England, some of my most memorable experiences, and I think most valuable really as well, were some of the friends I made in music, and I was on the running team at Cambridge for a bit, and just really that whole experience of living over there, sort of learning a new lifestyle, learning how people think, both in terms of the math and science I was doing, but in terms of sort of that in a broader context as well. And then here at Berkeley, it's been, I think, really healthy for me and important to me to keep up some of those things. So I still play in the orchestra here. I actually, completely separate from my work in grad school, I'm in Brazil for about 3 months every summer, running a nonprofit down there where I do both some music education and then some science education and sustainability projects as well. And that was definitely a not asking permission from my advisor to disappear for 3 months, and more telling him I'll be back in the fall. And it turns out he was fine with it. So I wouldn't I think grad school can be a lot more flexible and can include a lot of things sort of as you want it to, and more so than necessarily what's on paper. And certainly take advantage of that and make it into what you want it to be. And maybe I'll leave it at that for me and hand it off to the next person.
Hi again. So I was just going to tell you a little bit more about my background, because it sort of motivates the things that I learned and wish I had known before I started grad school. So during undergrad, I studied math, and I wanted the opportunity to learn how to apply it. So I did a program called the Iowa Summer Institute in Biostatistics to learn a little bit about that. And it really encouraged me to want to pursue graduate studies in biostatistics. But it was early on in undergrad, so I wanted to make sure that I tried a whole variety of things. So I had the opportunity to do research experiences and internships in different areas. And eventually I decided I still wanted to take a gap year between starting graduate school, and make sure that was what I wanted to commit 5 years to, and that was still right for me. So I actually took a gap year at a startup company, and a cool fact about that is that 2 Goldwater scholars actually recruited me for that opportunity. So I am really excited about the idea of having a community of Goldwater scholars. It was amazing to do research with them, and they were very valuable to me when I was applying to graduate school and to fellowships, because they had applied to the same fellowship. So I am really excited about this. After that, I decided to start a PhD. So I began pursuing a PhD in biostatistics at Harvard, and I really enjoyed pursuing biostatistics, but I didn't feel like the program was the best fit for me. So I transferred to the University of Iowa over this past summer, and I'm extremely happy I did. I think it's really important to be in the environment you want to be in and to be happy in graduate school, if you're going to be there for a really long time. So I think that's an equally important factor to consider when you're choosing schools. That being said, I guess my a few points to bring up would be: one, if you've had a research experience in a department kind of similar to the department you're going to be applying to for grad school, consider what you really like about that department. Maybe make a list of the things that you learned that you want in a graduate program based on your experience there. And then you could also make a list of maybe the things, if the department didn't have something that you want, that could be a good thing to include on that list. But definitely take that with you, because I feel like spending a whole summer somewhere, you learn a lot about a department and what would be good for you in graduate school, more than you learn even on some of the visit days. But you can at least take those things with you to see if you think that a program is the right fit or not. And then the second thing relates to applying to fellowships. So I applied to the National Science Foundation Fellowship. And as I mentioned, I had worked with people who had also applied to that one. And something that they provided me with that was really valuable is they shared their reviewer feedback with me. So when you apply, you get information from the reviewers about what they thought you did really well and what could have been improved. And they often give very tangible examples. So talking to people about the feedback they received, if they're open to talking to you about it, is really helpful in order to determine what the reviewers are looking for. So those are the two things that I thought were helpful and in guiding me in choosing the right graduate school and ending up in the place where I wanted to be. So yeah.
So this is Rachel Rosem. I guess with my experience, I would say that I started my undergraduate research in physics, biophysics, and as I was going through my research project, I went to a conference that had a lot of overlap between physics and ecology because I was doing some biophysics work. And that's where I realized I was much more comfortable with the ecological side of things. And I was initially worried that, I'm already so far in physics, I can't just pick a whole new field. This is not my background. But I would say that, especially as Goldwater scholars, but probably true of anyone who is doing undergraduate research or very involved in undergraduate work, you have the ability to change fields. You're very capable and can do it. And in addition, graduate school is often very interdisciplinary. So if you are interested in a field that is not what you studied initially, there still could be an overlap that you can look at when you're looking for professors to work for. And then I would say I was also part of the infamous two-body problem, where my husband and I were both trying to go to school, but we were in different years in undergraduate. So I ended up taking a gap year, and I would recommend not staying complacent while you do that. I did still apply for an NSF scholarship for the following year to go to grad school. And I will say that Goldwater often is a winning formula. The first time I applied for NSF, I got honorable mention. And then once I was in grad school and applied again, I did get it. So yeah, I would just say don't feel like you're stuck on any path. And keep applying for things, keep trying to do things. Don't worry about rejection or being unorthodox.
Okay, so I'll go next. I didn't mention before, but I won Goldwater in 2015 after being honorable mention in 2014. So even through reapplying for Goldwater, I learned that you really need to be specific in terms of what you want to do with your research in like NSF or any of the other prestigious scholarship applications, because the more specific you are, the more knowledgeable you sound, and it comes across as you knowing what you want to do, and someone's more likely to fund someone like that. And I applied for graduate school, Fulbright, and NSF all at the same time. And I had a couple other friends who also were Goldwater scholars that did the same thing. And one thing I'd recommend is be realistic about how much you want to dedicate to all of these applications, because people that applied for the Churchill, Marshall, Gates, all those tended to be overworked while they were also applying for the NSF and graduate school. So be specific on what you want to do. I decided that I would only apply to 5 graduate programs, and for me that wasn't very many, but I felt like I think that was all I could handle. And with NSF, it's required almost for my field, because in environmental engineering, the top 3 programs tend to be master's first and then PhD, and you have to reapply almost between your master's and your PhD. So having my own funding was really important. So realize how the programs are for graduate school before you decide what you want to apply for, because it's really important for certain fields to have NSF going in, especially to the decision process. Because even if you don't get into the program, you can always call them up and ask if you can, they would reconsider if you win NSF. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess I'll take it from the beginning again, right? So as we've said a couple times already, Rachel and I had this 2-body problem we had to work out, right? Which is, the most difficult problem in all of physics, I'm pretty sure. And so I just want to talk a little bit about some of the hoops that we had to jump through to get that to work out. So for starters, I'm a year older and a year ahead in school. And so I decided after my undergraduate degree was completed that I would stay an extra year and complete a master's degree. So I did that. I applied to other graduate schools, and I deferred my enrollment for a year, which was actually something I didn't know you could do until I did it, right? So you can apply to graduate schools, and then if you get into one you want to get into and then later decide you want to take a gap year, you can often request that of the graduate school, and they typically will grant it. Of course, that depends on their funding situation, and if you're accepted into a specific lab, then it depends on the policies of that specific lab. But it is something to keep in mind. And then after that, Rachel and I together applied to a bunch of graduate schools, because if there are 2 of you, you need to apply to more graduate schools because you have a smaller chance of both of you getting into the one you want to get into. So we did that, and we ended up going to Urbana-Champaign for a year, which had a program that was very good for me and not so good for Rachel, who took a gap year. And then we applied again and ended up at Penn State. So we've gone through this application process many times. And one thing that I find sort of difficult about this whole process is that it's not so much the act of applying itself, because applying to one graduate school is much like applying to another. You have to, of course, change your essays to, express your particular interest in a given program. but what I thought was difficult was deciding which schools to apply to, and going through the process of coming up with a list of schools that have programs you're interested in, because you can get a feel for what a department is doing, but that's not really what you're applying to in the end, right? Because you will be working for a specific person or small group of people when you're in graduate school. So the department is sort of less important than the professor who you'll be working under. And so it's really important to get a good feel for what it is they do, and not just sort of the broad overview you might get from looking at their webpage, but you need to have, well, I think you need to have at least read some of their recent papers, right? You need to know what they're actually working on right now, not what they were sort of interested in 5 years ago when they wrote up their little summary on their webpage, right? Because they're not necessarily kept up to date. So that involves a lot of reading, because you can get some kind of larger list by looking around for programs that are strong in specific areas. But then after that, you need to sort of hone your or narrow down your candidates, and that requires a lot of reading. So yeah, let me think if there's anything else I wanted to mention. Yeah, and the only other thing is that when it comes time to write up your personal statements or your and so on, you should make sure to mention what it is you learned through this process of reading these other professors' papers and so on, because these admission committees want to know why you're interested in attending this school specifically. And it's important that you mention that specific interest, I think, in your applications. And that, I'll leave it there. Pass it along.
Yeah, so I have the benefit of going last, so I can just kind of parrot what everyone else said. And actually, that's what I'm going to do a little bit, because I think everyone so far has talked about really important things about applying to graduate school as well as when you get to graduate school. So Alex brought up the point of applying to a bunch of different pre-graduate school fellowships, both the international fellowships as well as fellowships nationally. That's something that continues even into graduate school, though. There's a lot of really great fellowships and scholarships out there and grants out there for graduate students specifically. And it's a great opportunity for you to demonstrate I can generate funds to do my research, even if it's only $500, $1,000 to do something. It looks great moving forward for your career in research or your career outside of research. Both Melissa and Jordan talked a lot about kind of the application process in terms of the environment. And something that I usually say to people when applying to graduate school is it's much less about the institution you're applying to than either the person or the collective collective people you're applying to. And Jordan, you just brought this up as well. At the end of the day, really, and this is going to be field specific, but you're going to be working with one person, a couple of people, and that's where the bulk of your time in graduate school is going to be spent. So when you're thinking about the place you're going to apply, think about who does research that you like, or talk to mentors and ask them, hey, do you know about any good mentors out there that have research interests that are like mine? In terms of kind of the environment as well, though, there's something to be said about thinking about the holistic environment. Often the advice is given out there of don't worry about the place you're applying, like the geographic location. It's more about the school. I tend to say that's an important part of your experience as well, though, because if you're absolutely miserable where you are, that's going to bleed into what you're doing in graduate school. And there's a life outside graduate school, just like there's a life outside of your profession. And that's important to balance, and something that I think us in the academic community tend to forget about sometimes, unfortunately, because it really takes away from what we do. And then the last thing I'll touch on is a thread that came throughout all of this was the NSF. At least 3 or 4 of us here talked about it specifically. The NSF is great. I applied for the NSF my senior year of undergraduate and got it. So going into graduate school, I had this 3-year chunk of money that I was funded for, and provides actually a really, really nice stipend relative to a lot of other graduate school stipends, whether that be a TA or RA, so teaching assistant, research assistant line. So I highly encourage you all to apply for that. The Goldwater, I think even one of the summary statements I got from the NSF mentioned it. I think it's a really great kind of feather in the cap when you're applying for that NSF, and can really help put that application a little bit further. And I didn't have experience in applying for other of those international fellowships, but I'm sure is something that comes up there as well. So I'll leave it at that, because I know you probably all have good questions that we can answer. But just to echo some of the things that the other panelists said.
Thank you, panelists, for your summaries of your experiences. We will now answer some of the questions that have been coming in. The first question we want to ask is, how well is the Goldwater known, and did it come up in graduate school interviews?
I mean, I can answer this. I talked to a couple of professors during recruitment. So in the springtime after I got accepted, and a couple of them did mention it. I think it just depends on how much the school you're applying who focuses on undergraduate research and whether they will have known about it. So I think maybe even the biology student, biostatistics, I don't know if you have an interview for your process.
Yeah, so it did not come up during my interview process, but that's partially because I'm kind of on the fringe of the Goldwater kind of topic of interest. I'm on that edge of psychology, biology that is kind of the outshone child of the biological sciences. But it did come up in discussions applying for that NSF, and like I said, it did come up in the context of, I believe, one of the summaries from it. So at the end of the day, it's going to be a benefit. It's going to be a part of your CV. It's going to demonstrate that you can get competitive awards.
I'd say for me in ecology, most students and most professors have not heard of Goldwater, but my personal advisor and people on my committee who are engineers do know what it is, and it did come up in my interview, just that it's sort of a marker that yes, I'm interested in these things, and yes, I've put a lot of work into these things. But yeah, I think it depends on what field you're working in.
Just one more thing to add. So if you guys are including it in your application, you can always put a little caveat at the end of after you say Goldwater Scholarship and explain what it is in a few words, just so that you make it so that everyone can know. So even if they don't know, be like, oh, this is a national scholarship that's really competitive. Great. That's all they need.
And that holds for local university scholarships or fellowships as well, because no one's going to know what a kind of your University of X scholarship means. And even though it may not be as prestigious as a national, it's still going to hold weight, especially if you explain why you got it.
Thank you, panelists, so much for your answers. We will go on to the next question. How many schools did you apply to? Specifically, how many stretch schools, strong candidate schools, and sure thing schools? Some of you have already touched on this. Can the others talk a little bit about this?
I'll maybe jump in. I guess we could go around alphabetical, whoever hasn't already talked to. So I think I applied to 9 schools for grad school. In terms of what was a stretch or like a sure-in kind of place, I guess it's hard to say until I guess I only know where I got in and where I didn't. But I would say definitely I wouldn't necessarily kind of keep somewhere that you sort of have in mind as only a backup place, somewhere you think you'll get in but would be your last choice. Like I would only apply to places where maybe you think it might be easier to get into there versus other places, but where you know there are people there you would be happy working with, you'd actually be interested in doing research there. And if it doesn't really meet that bar, then I wouldn't bother just for the sake of getting in somewhere where you'd probably be unhappy and might not even go anyways. And yeah, so I would sort of, yeah, kind of get a feel with your advisor of what, or with mentees there, what's likely in terms of where you might get in or might not. But I wouldn't necessarily weigh too much in that either. Like, give it a shot places you'd like to do research and see what happens.
I applied to a good variety. So I was actually deciding between biostatistics and operations research applied to healthcare because I knew I wanted to apply the math or statistics to health. I more went for a diversity of programs in terms of size and location because going in, I wasn't set on any one place at the time. And I think for the math, especially biostatistics fields, the first 2 to 3 years are coursework, and they actually encourage you to come in, learn what your interests are, and then choose an advisor, which is, I know, a little different from some of the other fields. So I was more just trying to decide what my preferences were in terms of size, the diversity of research opportunities offered, and then I was deciding on field.
Okay, thanks again, panelists, for your answers. We will go on to our next question. How important, or what are the most important parts of the graduate school application? The GRE, the personal statement, or letters of recommendation, or are all three hold the same weighting?
So I want to jump in here because I've got some things to say.
Oh, go ahead.
So I took the GRE twice, and I remember in my interview here at Penn State, my advisor, my future advisor, was looking at these scores, and he looked up at me and said, "You're not a good test taker, are you?" Because the scores were like flipped. I did better in math the first time, and then way worse in math, but better in English. You know, like from my experience, I would say that the GRE matters to the extent that you need to show some level of being able to work under pressure, and it also makes you review a lot of things. But I would say that the threshold for GRE scores is probably lower than you think. And every place I've interviewed, I have heard from the professors that the letters of recommendation hold a lot of weight. Try to choose letter writers who not only, because what I've heard is a lot of people in my lab are international. What I've heard is that a lot of Americans will write very nice things no matter what, because they're not rude. Of course they like you, but it takes someone to know you really well to say these are their pitfalls, but I think they can still do it, and they will overcome that. So choose people that have worked with you and know your strengths and weaknesses. If you can. I mean, sometimes that's just not possible. Maybe you went to a place where undergraduate research is not very common, or you didn't do REUs or whatever, and that's fine. You know, as long as that is brought up in those letters, it's not a huge drawback.
I would definitely.
Yeah, the GRE 100%. It's kind of, well, there's kind of two thresholds with the GRE. There's the just good at, like, so your application doesn't get put in a pile because you have a first percentile, like low GRE score. So there's kind of a threshold, which, as Rachel said, is probably much lower than you think. And then there's an upper bar where there's a lot of kind of institutional fellowships that if you get very high GRE scores, you can potentially get. But I wouldn't worry too much about that. I wouldn't put too much weight into your efforts to master the GRE at the expense of all the other things that you could be working on. In terms of letters of rec, both from talking with people as well as experience in reading them. Anything less than hyperbole is often a red flag because they're often all just really nice and really good. So find someone that can speak really personally about you, because those personal letters really shine through. Usually the kind of most important part about an application is that personal statement / your just experience. So what sort of research experience do you have? If it's unrelated, how did that lead to where you are going now? How is what you've done? What's the roadmap to what you're applying to in graduate school? And why does that roadmap logically lead to this is why I'm a great fit for your graduate program? So I'd argue that's probably the most important part, and crafting that story of why you're applying.
I would just add, definitely echo that the letters are probably the most important part, but would add, don't think of that as being out of your control. I would directly, like, really work on that with the people you're having write. So meet with them beforehand, tell them, like, set out, I want you to talk about this research project and I want you to talk about such and such in classwork or whatever, so that each person kind of knows how they're fitting into the picture of your application. And then also just ask about other writers, like ask one advisor, who else should I have write? And when I did that, I had one person tell me, like, one of the names I had suggested, he said, that person would be a great fit, except I've seen their letters and they just don't write very convincing letters. So sorry, it's not going to work out well. So don't pick that person. And that's really helpful to know. So do ask those things directly and sort of take as much control as you can with the letters.
And also, in addition to the letters, I really took advantage of the network that my advisors had. So I met my faculty advisor now at a conference that 2 of my professors introduced me to. And I even worked with someone at another university for a summer program, and they connected me with someone else at a different university, and I got in there. So I think not only the letters, but also your connections that you make from your advisors is really important too.
My advisor is my old advisor's old advisee. So that network is a really important.
Thank you again, panelists, for your answers. We've got another question. Now that you're in graduate school, is there anything you wish you had done or known before attending grad school that you'd like to share with the attendees?
I'll go if no one's stepping up. So I feel like having the right advisor makes grad school the best or the worst. And I think knowing which questions to ask when you go to a recruitment or the interview, and I think for me, it was knowing what I wanted in an advisor. Some of the best advice I got when deciding what grad school to go to, my advisor at UCR said, don't think about what you could do for your advisor, but what your advisor can do for you. So if you're looking at a school to go into industry and your advisor mostly sends people to academia, then that might not be the right fit. Also, if your advisor requires that all of its students work 80 hours a week and you don't want to do that, then really think heavily before you make the decision to join that lab. So ask the questions about work-life balance, how they are as a mentor. I mean, recruitment, I was on the committee this last year, and we do a lot of hyperbole in terms of how amazing our advisors are, but I think it's important to ask the right questions on what you want and what you need in an advisor, because some people need their hands held in the beginning and then they're fine, which theoretically all of us should have something like that in grad school, but not everyone gives that. And so knowing if you can get that is important when you ask questions like that.
I guess I wish I would have known to contact some of the other grad students who would be in my now current lab to ask about things not related to grad school. I mean, so you often hear you should contact the graduate students to ask about grad school, but you should also contact them to ask about, you know, where's a good place to live, things like that, so you don't end up somewhere you're going to have to move out of very soon.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would say that this, where you're choosing, is somewhere that you may be living for 5 years. So it's important to know, where are good places to live? Are there things that are unfortunately a deal breaker for where you are? And I would say through my experience in like travel for REUs or just work trips, safety is a big deal. I mean, I remember being told that as an undergrad, be sure that where you're living is safe, and thinking, oh, that doesn't matter. But it really does. It makes a huge difference. Yeah, I mean, if I were not comfortable living somewhere for 5 years, I would not go there.
Thank you again, panelists. Our next question, how does the graduate school experience differ from the undergraduate experience?
Depends on your graduate school and your undergraduate school. I mean, I guess I would say in general, it's more work. More work and maybe more autonomy, perhaps. Especially after you're done with your coursework, right? So when you first go, you are often taking a lot of courses, and the courses are just harder courses. And then once you're past that and doing research full time, then it's still more work, but it's you have a lot more control over your time and so on than you used to, and that takes some extra diligence. And of course, this depends on your advisor's mentoring style, how much they want to micromanage your time. But that's I think the biggest difference for me really is I find you need to be much more self-driven in graduate school than in undergraduate school.
I would agree regarding the workload. That was definitely the case for me, that it ramped up in graduate school. So work-life balance was definitely something that I had to work on a lot last year, and I'm continuing to work on. I think there's potentially more competing priorities between your coursework and studying for qualifying exams, as well as the research that you're doing on the side, or a teaching assistantship. So I definitely think you have to be a little more careful about how you structure your time, but it's definitely something that you learn and that I'm still continuing to learn.
And I would say that once you're in grad school and have the time to dedicate to research, wherever that falls in your program, I have often heard and believe that you also need to manage your advisor in some ways. Like, yes, they are helping you, but this is your degree, and they have several students likely and their own projects, their own grants to write, all that. So they're not going to remember what you need to do. And so you will need to bring it up when you see them and hold yourself accountable, and ask them. Sometimes you need to ask them, what is the priority right now? Because as a student, you may be floundering, you're busy, this is all new, but your advisor's not going to remember your struggles. So manage them so they can manage you better.
Yeah, and I think for my advisor, we have 25 students, I think, right now in the group, both visiting, which is very large, both visiting and postdocs. And so it's a huge group. And I think it makes it a lot easier when you see your advisor a lot. And when someone has a lot of students, you never know how much you can see them. But knowing that I can see my advisor once a week during group meeting is really important. And I think not everyone has that, especially not even in my department. I think knowing how often you can see your advisor is really important in being successful. And because you see your professor usually twice a week or something in class in undergrad, but you don't always. You can go 2 months without seeing your advisor sometimes in grad school. So it's important to know how much you need to see them.
Okay, thank you. We will move on to our next question. We've had a few questions come in regarding international fellowships and how do you motivate STEM in another country and the differences in the application process. Alex, you might be able to expand on this one.
Sure. So I can start off with this. So I'll first say that so I study math and very much on the completely unapplied pure math side of things. So I'm maybe on the extreme in that like I really only need a notebook and an occasional internet connection anywhere in the world to do my work. And so in that sense, there's really no justification for studying abroad. But I think that's that there is a very good reason. And so I would look at it as the people side of things. So number one, you can sort of go specifically in terms of like this person is over there doing this research, blah 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 at this school. And it is certainly valuable being actually there with someone, not being able to just read their papers from somewhere else, but being able to drop in on their office, talk to them, work with them directly. So I think you can look at that. And I think that's no different internationally from applying to grad school in general, that you want to be looking at the people you'll be working with that and justify going there based on that. But then more broadly, so certainly my experience with the Marshall Scholarship is that a component of it is not purely academic, that it is really to go and learn about British culture as well. And both in terms of what they want to see your reasons for going are, and then sort of having done it now, what I think really is an important part of the experience as well. So I did write very directly in my application that I wanted to do things like play in an orchestra over there and sort of see what the music scene is like in Cambridge and in London and have that experience and sort of get to learn a different culture through sort of bringing my music there and working with them. And so I think do talk about things like that, about the sort of the broader life experience of it. That is something unique to where you'd be applying, be it England and a couple of the ones there, or Fulbright, or wherever it may be. So I think really pull it into a whole picture, not just a question of lab equipment or sort of simply research questions and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and to top that off, I agree with everything you said. And with Fulbright, since it's country specific, especially England's extremely competitive because you don't need to learn another language. It's important to know that if you're going to go to this country, the cultural differences, they need to make sure that you're also emotionally and like completely ready to go and immerse yourself in that culture, because you're there for a year or 10 months, and it's sometimes the timeline is a little off, especially if you want to go to Asia. And so you really have to make sure that you know what you're getting yourself into with Fulbright. But Fulbright was something that I would have never thought about doing even 3 years ago, before I even thought about applying, because I hadn't traveled abroad. And so it's something that really opened my eyes to the world. And Germany is very much a country that focuses heavily on the STEM field. It's in their constitution that it has to be funded. So it's everyone just kind of goes with the flow with science, and they kind of take it for granted in some sense. But it's really something that I think everyone should get the opportunity to do, even in grad school, because you don't have to be right out of undergrad to do a Fulbright. You can do it during grad school. NSF has a program to go abroad as well to a certain number of countries. So I think if you can take advantage of it, because you can develop your international connections at conferences, and it makes pretty much your outlook on life, especially, completely different.
Thank you again. We will move on to our next question. How many grad school visits did you make, and who paid for them?
I believe I went on 5. And I didn't get to bring this up when we were talking about applying to schools. But going into the grad school process, I was about 95% certain I was going to go to the school that I ended up going to. That said, I still applied to 7 different schools, in part because it's important to look elsewhere. But one of the other big benefits of going on those grad school visits is you get these 30-minute one-on-one interviews with big folks in your field. and that's not something you're going to get elsewhere. And so it's a really great experience of going on these trips, getting to spend this time with this person that's interested in you and wants to talk to you. And that can carry forward into seeing them again at conferences down the line, and can be a really valuable experience. In terms of paying, most paid for me. I did have at least one that I had to pay to travel to, but most ended up paying for travel to and lodging for. It was just kind of mix. You do have to pay though for all the applications. So the more you apply to, the more you're going to pay for those applications.
And the more exhausted you'll be when you have to go visit all those places.
Yes, that I will say, for anyone that's applying, as I applied as a senior in undergrad and was balancing my senior spring with going on all those trips, with being in the spring play, with doing field work, and it was not a lot of fun. So just keep that in mind. The more schools you apply to, the more interviews you go on, the more potentially exhausted you will be.
Yeah, I went on, I think 6 visits, and it was during the year I took working. So I would also add, some of them were like back to back in a week. So it got pretty tiring by the end. But definitely run it by, especially if you're working, make the people who you're working with or working for aware that you're going to be on these visits, because it can take a lot of time, and that could also influence how many schools you choose to apply to. Another point that I think Justin brought up about getting to know the professors, that was a really great experience. And in addition to getting to know some of the experts in the field that you're looking at, I have still even stayed connected with a lot of the students who ended up going to other programs. So it's also another way to build your network. And when you go to conferences, you'll see a lot of familiar faces. So it was definitely a great experience for that too.
I actually went on 0 visits because I was living in England at the time, but was classified as a domestic student. So I was only offered domestic funding for travel, and the timing really didn't fit with the English course schedule. So it just didn't really work out. And it ended up with the places I'd gotten in that I was able to do a lot remotely and have a pretty set, feel pretty confident about where I was ending up. But I have actually, now that I've been in grad school, I've actually organized the visits for the last couple years. And I do think it is valuable if you can get the chance. And maybe would say, a lot of the students I've seen coming in seem very hesitant about sort of being awkward about asking certain things and whatnot. And at that point, you're accepted already. You're interviewing the school now to see if they're good enough for you. And so ask all of the hard questions, like ask directly, is this advisor taking students still? What is the funding situation like? Talk to other grad students, see if they're happy, and get as much as you can out of it going there. Don't feel like you have to tiptoe around the situation. Grad students love to gossip about what's going on, so ask them.
Yeah, in one of my visits, I even had my scholarship program pay for it, because it was in the UC system. So sometimes if they don't give you enough money, you can ask from your school for funding for a visitation.
Okay, thank you all for all your great questions. And the panelists, thank you so much for your answers. I'm sorry if we didn't get a chance to get to your questions today. So you may be able to reach out to the panelists on the Slack community. So please be sure to join that workspace. And panelists, if you can especially share your experiences with NSF and REU. We've had some questions on that we didn't get to. And now we will send it back to John.
I want to thank all of the panelists for the great advice you provided today. Worrying about not only academics and burying yourself in a research lab, but you have to worry about where you're going to live and who you're going to interact with, and those kinds of issues, which are extremely important in terms of your ultimate success in graduate school. Not worrying about the GRE so much. The letters of recommendation, I think you were spot on. What I would encourage students to do as early on as possible is cultivate those relationships so that you have those letters when you need them. Again, you covered all of these points in great detail, and I'm delighted to have had all of you on this panel. You all brought interesting perspectives to this discussion. We knew ahead of time that we weren't going to be able to answer all the students' questions, so we have set up this Slack community. I will be emailing out later today, maybe tomorrow morning, invitations to join that Slack community, and I hope you all do. And so you can continue this conversation with these students, with the panelists that were on Monday, and 30 other graduate students that have agreed to join the discussion. So I thank you all for joining the webinar today. Again, thank you panelists for the time you've taken out of what I know are busy schedules. I can remember back to my own graduate school days, even though that was a few years back. So thank you all, and wish you all the best in grad school.